To say that Firestorm is DC's most powerful superhero is kind of an understatement. Right, this dude is cracked. I know a lot of people will say, well, what about Captain Atom? Let's be honest with ourselves, guys. Captain Atom has well and truly transitioned into godhood. This guy is as far removed from being a superhero as pretty much any godly being you could imagine, right? So I don't really even consider him part of the superhero landscape anymore, despite the fact that he seemingly is. But focusing on Ronnie Raymond, right? For those of you guys who don't believe me when I tell you how powerful he is, in Mark Waid's World's Finest, which is a comic run that he's currently writing that focuses on the adventures of Batman and Superman in the early days of their coming together as a team, they cross over into the Kingdom Come universe. While it is a different universe, the powers are the same. Firestorm in that reality turns the air around Superman's head into kryptonite gas. So yeah, this dude's pretty cracked, right? This guy alters matter on the molecular level, both organic and inorganic. He's essentially Molecule Man from Marvel Comics in the DC universe. So the reason why I say this is the fury of Firestorm as part of DC All In, where DC is focusing on characters that don't normally get a whole lot of attention. This story is written by Jeff Lemire, and the way this opens up is it says, on the first day the nuclear man descended from the heavens, he was alone, yet he spoke, as if to another. The nuclear man was troubled, and if someone had been there to see it, they would swear that his face was constantly changing. On the second day, the nuclear man walked into the town of Bedford, Colorado. Seeing a nuclear man, head aflame and eyes white with the power of suns, was not a common occurrence in Bedford, and the townfolk pointed and stared. The nuclear man seemed to pay them no mind, as if he didn't know they were alive at all, until suddenly he did. God helped them. On the third day, the nuclear man began to experiment. He wanted to know what it would be like to live in a world of glass and chalk, so he made one. Not everyone liked living in a world of glass. The townspeople cried out and wrung their hands, demanding the nuclear man put things back to normal. But the nuclear man did not subscribe to their idea of normal. Their lives were a mere illusion. He would teach these people the only thing truly normal was change. So, on the fourth day, the nuclear man transformed not only their world, but them as well. He literally transformed them all into glass and chalk. He just recreates reality in this localized space, right? And it says, and on the fifth day, realizing what he'd done, the nuclear man wept. On the sixth day, the nuclear man decided any vestiges of emotion he once had were no longer of any consequence, and in freeing himself from this burden, he truly began his great work. And on the seventh day, he rested. Because what he's seemingly doing here, right? I mean, there's this shot where he's like merging two people together. He's literally restructuring reality. He's rebuilding the world within this space, seemingly with the intention of spreading outward. But notice this, the way that Jeff Lemire phrases this, right? On the first day he arrived. By the seventh day, he's creating life. It's the story of Genesis. It's the story of God's creation of Earth. Right? It's crazy, right? To present him as a god in that fashion, this is not an accident. So, having said that, I know a lot of you guys out there are big fans of Firestorm, and you may not have been following his character, and even more of you guys probably don't know who he is at all. So, let's provide some context for the character of Ronnie Raymond in DC Comics. So the reality is that this comic really comes out of Doomsday Clock in a lot of ways, and kind of the lead up to Doomsday Clock. So it's important to understand that so you can understand what the comic is doing by the time we get to the end. Otherwise, you'll be hopelessly lost. So, winding the clock back a little bit, historically speaking, when it comes to the Firestorm Matrix, which is basically the source of Firestorm, it's always had two hosts. Those two hosts have been Ronnie Raymond and Professor Stein. Now, the old school story of Ronnie was that he was caught up in an accident with Professor Martin Stein, and that's how the two of them merged into the Firestorm Matrix in the first place. They go forward as Firestorm, doing superhero stuff, some morally questionable things, but then Ronnie Raymond eventually dies. Enter Jason Rusch. And so leading up to the New 52, Jason Rusch and Martin Stein were basically the hosts of the Firestorm Matrix. Now, as most of you guys probably know, New 52 was when DC rebooted their entire continuity. Everything was started all over again. Initially, it was celebrated until fans started to see how it was fleshed out, and then they weren't so happy about it. In the New 52 landscape, instead of Martin Stein being one part of the Firestorm Matrix, it was Jason Rusch, but also Ronnie Raymond. It was basically combining the two characters from before the New 52. And honestly, I always thought it was kind of cool, right? The reality is that I was never a huge like Professor Stein and Ronnie Raymond fan because I never grew up with that version of Firestorm. I didn't start reading him until I started reading about his character in the New 52. Having said that, Ronnie Raymond was like the brawn of the operation, and Jason Rusch was the brains of the operation. So you still kept that mythos intact because in the old school stories, Martin Stein would actually teach Ronnie how to harness his powers. He would teach him how to push his powers to greater heights, which is how he gained greater and greater abilities as time went on. Jason Rusch did the same thing, but having two students basically operating as two halves of the Firestorm Matrix provided a kind of youthfulness to the storytelling. Such as it was, one of the big complaints that people had about the New 52 was that it wiped out so much of the history of the DC universe before the New 52, right? All that history was gone. And even when that history was brought back, it was done in a way that was hand-wavy and kind of non-believable. So to sidetrack from Firestorm for a second, the history of Batman, right? The time in which his parents had died, running all the way up to when he traveled and became like the best fighter in the DC universe, right? Dick Grayson, Jason Todd, any of the other members of the Bat family being rolled in, all the events of Batman Incorporated when he spreads around the world and basically creates Batman teams all over the place or brings people in from all over the place, Barbara Gordon being shot to the back, his back being broken by Bane, all of that happened in like a 5-year period, right? It was silly. Right? And so a lot of fans weren't huge fans of that. And so for the character of Firestorm, it was similar. That seemingly a lot of fans wanted to see the return of the Ronnie Raymond and Martin Stein persona, or the Jason Rusch and Martin Stein persona. Regardless of how you slice it, what DC did in 2016 as part of Rebirth is they launched this story called Legends of Tomorrow. It was a 6-issue miniseries, and in issue number 2, Ronnie Raymond and Jason Rusch are separated by Martin Stein himself. And by the end of the comic, Ronnie Raymond and Martin Stein merge back together again. So it's a return of the old school Firestorm. Now that takes us into a story called Doomsday Clock. The reason why Doomsday Clock is so important is because when DC launched Rebirth, what they wanted to do was bring back a lot of that history from before the New 52. But the question they had to answer was, where did it go? Why doesn't anybody remember all these things that supposedly happened? And so Doomsday Clock centered on Ozymandias and Dr. Manhattan from the Watchmen universe coming to the main DC universe. They had their own individual plots. Dr. Manhattan was the one responsible for changing time and history. Ozymandias was just doing what he does, being a dick. And so for the character of Firestorm, the big change for him came in the form of what was called the Superman conspiracy. The idea being that what Ozymandias had essentially done was put out there into the world the idea that Superman, alongside pretty much every American-based metahuman, was created by the United States government. While that is true for some of the characters, it certainly wasn't true for characters like Superman or Batman or Wonder Woman or the Flash or the Green Lantern. But the entire motivation behind Ozymandias was to destroy the public's perception of Superman and metahuman superheroes as a whole, just sowing chaos and divisiveness. However, for the character of Firestorm, it was true, and this is the caveat that I was talking about earlier. And truth to tell, depending on who you were talking to, this was a very divisive retcon. The idea was that during Doomsday Clock, Firestorm goes to attack Dr. Manhattan, and Dr. Manhattan sends him 7 years into the past, where he learns that the experiment that led to him merging with Martin Stein was not an accident. It was done intentionally by Martin Stein in order to get into and to learn about the nature of metahumans within the DC universe. Martin Stein did have his own personal motivations, but that retcon origin was the huge shift. And so by the time you get to the end of Doomsday Clock, despite this huge revelation, Ronnie Raymond and Martin Stein do basically stay together. But that takes us into a story called Lazarus Planet. The whole idea behind Lazarus Planet was to basically create this kind of Lazarus rain that was spreading across the world after a volcanic eruption. And it was a way for DC to kind of shuffle the landscape of powers. So for those of you guys who remember how events transpired at the end of Absolute Power, where some people gained new powers, powers were traded around, different things like that, imagine that. Lazarus Planet was very similar to that. There was certainly more to the plot than that. And so as part of Lazarus Planet, we got a comic called Legends Reborn, and one part of it focused on Ronnie Raymond as Firestorm. What ends up happening is he and Martin Stein are separated, and during that event, Robbie ends up merging with a guy named Dr. Ramirez. This was an attempt to reset the status quo, hence Legends Reborn, kind of reworking Firestorm. What ends up happening by the end of that story is there's an effort to separate Dr. Ramirez Ramirez from Ronnie Raymond, but you end up learning that whenever you're bonded to the Firestorm Matrix, specifically whoever's bonded with Ronnie, has time stolen from them. It's a little loose and hand-wavy, but in effect, it was a way for DC Comics to come along and say that Martin Stein had been aged so badly during his time in being one part of the host of the Firestorm Matrix that by the time he was separated, he was essentially an invalid. And so now, Dr. Ramirez is the guy who's combined with Ronnie from here on out. And so that kind of gets us to where we are right now. There are a couple stories that take place in between, but you can kind of assume this one picks up immediately after the events of Legends Reborn. However, all that stuff that I just told you, I want you to keep that in the back of your head because that will become important by the end. And so picking back up with a story out in Pittsburgh at 4 o'clock in the morning, there's this knock on a door. And when this girl answers, you end up having all these soldiers who address her as Lorraine Riley. Now, Lorraine Riley, before the New 52, was a love interest for Firestorm. It's a little wonky in the early days. She was falling in love with him despite not really knowing anything about him, but there was a very human element to the nature of her character. The late great Jerry Conway did a fantastic job in how he handled her. But by the time you get to the New 52, she doesn't really show up again until Doomsday Clock. But that's why they're here, is because as we know now, in this day and age, because you have a kind of merger between the New 52 and the pre-New 52, we know at the very least, she was at one point the girlfriend of Ronnie Raymond. There is her appearance in Doomsday Clock issue number 9, but from what I can tell, she didn't really reappear in DC Comics once the New 52 started until you got to Doomsday Clock number 9. But the bigger point is they're here because of her past relationship with Ronnie. Because when she asks, like, why are you guys here? The soldiers tell her, Department of Defense, Miss Riley, we need you to come with us. And she just asks, like, what if I say no? And they tell her, then we have been authorized to use any force necessary, Miss Riley. And so she's like, okay, then let me get dressed. And so what ends up happening is on the flight out there, we kind of get this bit of an abreast about the nature of Ronnie, which is really everything that I've kind of told you. And so as they're traveling, one of the soldiers asks the other guy, who or what is Firestorm? And she says, he's a young man named Ronnie Raymond, but he's also college professor and physicist Dr. Martin Stein. Firestorm is actually 2 men. Remember that big explosion at the Hudson nuclear power plant years ago? Stein and Raymond were caught at ground zero, and it somehow fused them together. The consciousness of Stein and Raymond combined into something they called the Firestorm Matrix. Together, they became the hero, Firestorm. Now, don't let the puffy sleeves fool you. This guy is a level 10 meta. He can literally transmute matter at the atomic level. The horrors that this guy can inflict are only limited by his imagination. Over the years, Firestorm's nature has been in flux. Different personas, different looks, and even different powers. The one constant is that he has been completely unstable since his creation, and now he's finally gone off the leash. And so once that bit of a story is finished, then the question is asked, okay, so who is she? And that's where this soldier's told she was an active metahuman, codenamed Firehawk. She was the target's girlfriend. And so when hearing all of this, right, Lorraine is just kind of like, okay, so one, you guys know I can hear you, right? Super hearing, that's one of the powers that I have, which they didn't know about. And 2, she was like, so when are you gonna tell me what it is that I'm doing here? And why are you calling Ronnie Raymond the target? And that's when they hand her a tablet and say, you need to take a look at this, ma'am. And they say, this is satellite footage from Bedford, Colorado yesterday. Your ex-boyfriend flew into town and started having his way with it. He turned the place into his own John Carpenter nightmare factory. And that, in looking at all of this, is when she says, that is not Ronnie Raymond. And the question's asked, really, because the flaming head is kind of a dead giveaway if you ask me, but she knows him on a very intimate and personal level. And so she says, I don't care what it looks like. There is nothing behind those eyes. I know Ronnie better than anyone. That is not Ronnie. And so at that point, they say, well, one way or another, we're about to find out. And so she doesn't really know. Like, she doesn't have the full totality of what's going on here. Right? And so she asks, like, what are you talking about? And they tell her, you're going in, Miss Riley. Sergeant Waters and I will be your escorts. And Sergeant Waters says, the powers that be seem to think that your history with Raymond may be enough to get through to him and de-escalate before we need to attempt more drastic measures. Now, have no illusions. De-escalate simply means bring him down long enough for the government to be able to take him, right? That's really all it is. I mean, it's not one of these things where it's like, let's talk him down, right? Let's have a conversation. And if there is some big misunderstanding, right, we understand, we can kind of get things figured out, and then he can go about his business. No, this is not the Marvel Universe. That is not how things work. And so once they land out here in Bedford, which this is a military zone now, just outside the city. I mean, you got tents, the whole 9 yards. The question's asked, have your people made any contact with him yet, General? And he just says, no, right? He tells Sergeant Waters, not yet. We've just been holding the perimeter and praying that all this does not spread out any further. Satellites show the target is still just sitting there on a park bench. He has not moved in nearly 14 hours. And what's really funny here, Lorraine Riley, who also operates under the name Firehawk because she has powers and she does manipulate fire, she does ask the question, to be honest with you, like, what do you think those suits are going to do? And they just tell her, experimental units, right? They give off a tachyon aura that should make them immune to the target's matter-changing powers. And the general speaks up and says, speaking of which, you should suit up as well, Miss Riley. And she's like, yeah, I brought my own. And she changes into her Firehawk suit and all the powers that come with it. And so she's like, are we doing this or what? And so they enter into Bedford. And this is awesome the way this goes down, right? That the statement's made, if the intel we got is accurate, Dr. Martin Stein is no longer part of the Firestorm Matrix. It seems Stein and Raymond had a falling out a few months back. Since then, Raymond has somehow been piloting the Firestorm Matrix solo. Maybe it was too much for him to handle alone. Now, again, that's why we went through all this history, so you could understand what's happening in this comic. What DC is essentially doing, specifically Jeff Lemire, is they're wiping all that history away. Basically, everything after the events of Doomsday Clock. So the events of Lazarus Planet and all that stuff, him merging with Dr. Ramirez, none of that is seemingly in continuity more. What seems to be going on here is that following the events of Doomsday Clock, somehow or another, Martin Stein and Ronnie Raymond were separated. And so as they're walking along, one of the guys says, heads up, right, we're about to enter whatever in the hell this is. But I'd call it a horror show, because once they get in here, it's exactly that. The entirety of the town on a molecular level has been restructured and altered. It's one part a house of horrors, and it's another part almost like a fever dream, right? The houses are different colors. There's fire just kind of floating out there, right? People have been transmuted. They've been turned into fire, right? I mean, it's just kind of crazy, right? It's like what you would expect to see if you cracked open a Doctor Strange comic from back in the 60s. Right? And so as Lorraine makes her way through this, people who have been turned to stone, people who have been turned to glass, she just says, my God, right? This is not Ronnie. There's no, like, he would never do anything like this. And they see him just sitting on a bench over there. And one of the soldiers says, let's ask him, right? And so like they walk up to him and Lorraine just calls out, Ronnie, right? And she says, Ronnie, is that you? And Firestorm just looks at her and asks, you, right? And she says, Ronnie, it's me. But he keeps asking the same question, you, that's it. And so that immediately is when the soldiers become active, right? Power readings are flaring, he's active. And they tell him, stand down, Raymond. And in that moment, he destroys one of the guys on the spot, just obliterates him. But Firestorm asks the question, Raymond. So seemingly, Firestorm doesn't know who he is. He doesn't know that he's Ronnie Raymond, which is kind of nuts. Because in that moment, right, the other soldier, because Sergeant Waters is the one who's killed, the other soldier is just like, the suits, right, the suits don't work. Raymond killed Waters. And that's kind of what Firehawk was telling them, right? Not really in direct terms, but that's kind of what she was telling them. Those suits aren't going to do anything. But even in the face of the fact that she was right, she's more taken aback by the fact that Ronnie Raymond, right, Firestorm, so callously destroyed a soldier. The guy's always been a little bit reckless, been a little bit of a hothead, and just sometimes downright stupid, right? But to engage in an act like this, it's just good old-fashioned callousness, right? And so that's when she looks at him and just says, that is not Ronnie Raymond. And so the question that they ask is, if that's not Raymond, then where is Ronnie Raymond? And that's when you switch over to Ronnie himself as Firestorm, flying through the air. You've got Martin Stein next to him, because this is how the comics used to look back in the day, right? Ronnie Raymond's flying around and like the head of Martin Stein is out there. It wasn't actually floating next to him in the comic. It was just an artistic representation of like what was going on in the head of Ronnie Raymond as he was flying around, right? But Martin Stein tells him, right, Ronald, please, you're gonna make me sick again. And he's like, come on, Professor Stein, you don't even have a body. Right? You can't get sick at all. And Stein's just like, well, I mean, be that as it may, I still feel what you do, Ronnie, right? And that's where Ronnie's just kind of like, I mean, that's really weird to think about, right? I mean, I know we're both inside the Firestorm Matrix, but don't you ever wonder how it works, or seemingly that's what he's going to ask, because before he can give us that final question, Martin Stein just asks, "What is it, Ron?" Because he looks over and he sees something. And he's like, "We'll save the deep thoughts for later, Professor. It looks like Hyena is on the loose again," right? And in that moment, Hyena looks at him and it's like, "Firestorm," right? And he's like, "Hey, Furball, long time no steal, and not even a full moon out. Last time I checked, you were still locked up in Pittsburgh Penitentiary," right? And Hyena's just like, "You are not supposed to be here." And so when Hyena attacks him, right, Ronnie says, "That actually hurts." And Martin Stein says, "Careful, Ronald, he's about to attack again." And he does, right? And in that moment, Firestorm jumps out of the way. "Piece of cake, Professor Stein. Actually, that's a pretty good idea." And in turn, he just like transmutes an entire bus into cake and says, "And I know just the recipe too. Our molecular transmutation powers will handle the rest." And just blasts Hyena into it and says, "See, Hyena, I always knew you were sweet on me." But Hyena comes back and says, "No, don't you see? This is not where you need to be." And then he asks the question, "Then where am I supposed to be?" And then Martin Stein, in looking at Ronnie, just asks, "Ronald, are you okay?" And Ronnie just says, "I don't really know." And then suddenly we switch to this dark forested area, right? And at that point we start to realize he's in his own mindscape, right? He's in his own mind. And then he calls out to the professor who doesn't answer. And that's when Firestorm appears directly to Ronnie and says, "You are not supposed to be here. I no longer belong to you, Ronald Raymond. I belong to no one." Now, anybody who's familiar with the writing of Jeff Lemire immediately knows what he's drawing on, right? How many of you guys read the Century Volume 3 from Jeff Lemire? Because that's what happens. We're introduced to Sentry World, right? Doctor Strange literally creates this pocket reality where the Sentry is effectively locked away in that world, where he can be the Sentry without ever having to risk releasing the Void. It's taking that concept and rolling it over here. And I gotta be honest with you, I love the way that it's done. It's a phenomenal concept, because what ends up happening here is that when Firestorm blasts Ronnie Raymond, because the Firestorm Matrix seems to be operating of its own volition outside of the influence of Ronnie, you jump back into Firestorm world, right? "Please, Ronald, you're going to make me sick again." It's repeating itself, right? "Be that as it may, I still feel what you do, Ronald," right? But the whole time that this segment's going on, you start to zoom out from the Firestorm Matrix, and you find out that's what's happening inside of its mind. It's a self-contained world. But here in the real world, Firestorm is just standing there, right? But that's when we're kind of realizing what's going on. And so the other soldier is just looking at him, right? What's he doing? What's going on in there? And Firestorm just looks at the soldier and says, "No one," and blasts the soldier on the spot. And Lorraine is just like, "What the hell?" Right? And he says, "I am no one," and goes to attack Lorraine yet again, hitting her with power over and over and over again, and sends her flying out of Bedford. And so once she lands among the soldiers, they're just like, "Miss Riley, are you okay?" And she says, "I can't do it. I can't stop that. There is nothing any of us can do. We have to find him." And they ask the question, "Find who?" And she says, "The only person who knows Ronnie better than I do. We have to find Professor Stein." And so that's when we switch over to this final scene on this final page with Dr. Martin Stein himself. Now, again, this is why we did all that history, but what he's doing is picking up in the aftermath of Doomsday Clock, and seemingly all that history with Firestorm appearing in absolute power and all that kind of stuff is intact. The one thing that it looks like he's leaving out is the story of Lazarus Planet, the events that transpired in it. So as it stands right now, it looks like the whole story arc with Dr. Ramirez and him merging with Ronnie Raymond is gone, right? By whatever manner and whatever means, because literally you have Martin Stein throwing these pages into a fireplace, and one of them asks the question, "Is it sentient?" By whatever manner and whatever means, Ronnie Raymond and Professor Stein separated. The Firestorm Matrix is operating of its own volition, and it's trapping Ronnie inside of his own mind, so the Matrix can act accordingly. But again, it's a mystery. This is why I love Jeff Lemire. So, with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, drop a like. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.